Hello everyone, welcome to the webinar. We've got lots of questions to get through, but just before we start, lots of people have been asking about the Callum video and how should we deal with Callum, the student in the clip. So what we've done is we have given you links to two other clips that have got slightly different outcomes. And if you look at the teacher behaviour in both of those clips, you'll start to work out some alternatives. What's really interesting about that Callum video piece is that what it's easy to miss is he's triggered, his temper is triggered before the teacher even intervenes the first time. And she doesn't really deal with that first intervention properly. So hopefully you'll see that in the other two clips there are some angles you might not have seen and perhaps some techniques that you might like to employ with Callum. What's really funny about Callum is he's a lovely child. In fact, all those children in the videos from a South London school, not trained as actors at all, took on the role. In fact, Callum is nothing like Callum is in the video. He's a very lovely young man, but he just had that look and he was perfect for the role. So do have a look at those, and we'll post these two links in the discussion forum as well, so you can chat about them as we go along. So I'm going to move on to some questions. What we've done essentially is we've tried to get 6 of the most pertinent questions from all of the different responses. There's so many fantastic posts on the forums, and I saw people helping each other out as well as waiting for responses. So we tried to group these questions that cover some of the key themes and some of the things that people have been really keen to explore further. So the first is that question 1 from Mark Crooks. I have this all the time. I am constantly shocked by the amount of people who come up to me in a training session and say, love your stuff, great ideas, want to employ it all, but I'm getting caned for people asking me to give more detentions. So we realise that it's difficult sometimes when you don't have a voice in the school policy, but I would encourage people to take some of the work they've been doing on this course and put it in front of the decision makers, and hopefully it will give a little bit of weight towards your argument. But I know that some schools are very, very detention heavy, and so I would be encouraging you to try to reduce that use of detention, not by going against the school policy, because having a consistent school policy is really critical, but perhaps not using the detention quite as harshly. There are some schools who say, well, you have to put names on the board of children who behave badly, and I would start to gently question that. If I had to give detentions, I'd make sure that I was there personally to oversee them wherever possible. And I'd make really sure that that detention was not just personal, but it was productive. So I helped the student with the work, or as you'll see in the next part of the course, I'd look to do some sort of restorative conversation so we redraw the lines before the next lesson. I think there are also issues in some schools with people saying, well, we'd love to do phone call homes, but the management won't let us. In fact, that was my position for 5 years in the first school I taught in, that it was only the middle managers and the senior managers that were able to phone home, and that's fine, that can work. I think you just need to speak to the person who is going to phone home, to brief them properly, and maybe even to say, can I sit alongside you while you do it? Obviously schools are very sensitive about families getting too many phone calls and being overloaded with phone calls, and also you can get that situation, of course, where you want to make a positive phone call, but that child has just received some bad news from the school for some kind of misdemeanor, and of course the school doesn't want mixed messages going home. So I can see why a school would want to sort of start to control the amount of phone calls going home. But I think if you very quickly brief that person and they say, I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Dix, he is so pleased with, then I think you can have that similar impact. And of course, you'll be using the positive notes as well to back that up. So question 2, top set year 9 group causing low-level disruption, listening for a minute and back chatting. Sometimes I have to wait for attention. It always reminds me of a teacher I had to sit in with in a coaching session in a school that will remain nameless in Bristol, who for 45 minutes repeated the same phrase, I'm waiting, I'm waiting, I'm waiting. And I've also seen people waiting for silence and it be really efficient and it be a really good cue for the children. The key here is if you have not taught them that you falling silent is an immediate cue for them to give you their attention and you haven't practiced that, you can't expect them just to adopt that from another situation and bring it to your lesson. So I think improving that situation is all about stepping your learners through what you expect. If you want to fall silent and get them to fall silent too, practice it, rehearse it, reinforce it when it goes well, and use your negative consequences for those children who don't join the routine. I think actually, and at the base of this, I'm not going to wait for children for more than a few seconds. And so I use a countdown from 5 when I've got large classes and they're busy doing practical work. And I'll say 5 and then I'll immediately catch someone doing the right thing. 5, that's fantastic, right? Your eyes on me, you've put your equipment down, thank you. 4, what I need you to do is come back to the benches and take thank you. 3, so I'm constantly using positive reinforcement. When I get down to 0, the first thing I'm going to do is reinforce those children who have done the right thing. Fantastic, those 2 tables over there. You were very quickly very quickly giving me your attention. You had your equipment safely away, brilliant. And then I would give those students who had decided not to listen to my countdown, I'd give them a warning, I'd give them a negative consequence. I'd try and do that privately, but I know that when you've got 30 students in the room, that's sometimes difficult. And I would absolutely make to the point to them and follow that up that when I do the countdown, I expect everyone to be quiet. I don't think it's acceptable for teachers to be waiting minutes for classes to fall silent. It's about sharpening that routine. I mean, with most of the classes we work with, the countdown becomes from 3, 2, 1, and it can be done very, very quickly. And it's part of just that auto-routining, that relentless routining of the standards that you want. If you want them to fall silent at the drop of a hat, you can do that, but you've got to put the work in first and foremost. And it's got to come from teaching them the actual behaviours you want to see. So when I fall silent, I expect you to return to your seats, put your equipment down and have eyes on me. Again, we're using that rule of 3 to try and make it really simple and straightforward. I think also I would be using the recognition board here so that if I have to at any point, so perhaps 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then immediately writing up those students who have done the right thing on the recognition board, it is a really nice indicator. So they get the idea that it's absolutely worth their while and they're recognised for falling quiet. As we're following through with that idea that learners who do the wrong thing get second attention, it would be entirely natural for you then, as they're working, just to go around, give a warning, give a reminder to those children who chose not to fall silent when you needed their attention. I think, it's one of those routines that newly qualified teachers and teachers transferring to a different school find very, very difficult. At the base of really excellent teachers is years of routining their children into doing things with a glance, with a hard stare, with a small sign, a small cue. And for the rest of it takes us time to build up that kind of capacity with our groups. So question 3. I'll give you a second to read that one. Julie, I think this question is one that many, many teachers will recognise. That sort of spiral into, it's not cool to be recognised for doing the right thing. It's not cool to be a study boy. At the bottom of that is the culture and the climate that really needs addressing very quickly. You don't want to have that spiral of low achievement and then it's cool to achieve and it gets out of control very quickly. So I think our focus on the culture of the classroom, our focus on your expectations and your standards is key. We as teachers would want to confront directly the false idea that behaving badly is cool. We'd probably want to break that down a little bit and show them some real examples of the high expectations that we expect and what that can then lead to. I'd want to use a whole class recognition board. I want to really emphasize that rather than recognizing individuals and putting names on the board, I might just turn that into a tally. So that rather than identifying children and publicizing how well they've done, while I'm trying to just change the culture, I'll do that privately. In lots of the pupil referral units we work in, we have like a racetrack around the room, and the children have their own cars, but they're coloured and designed as they want them. They don't have their names on them. So you can quite privately give them some reinforcement without publicising it to the rest of the group. You can also do that. Okay, there's a group in here, I don't want to mention them. They did some outstanding homework this week, and I'm just going to give them 3 more tallies on the chart. You don't need to know who they are, but they are contributing to the whole. So we've got our recognition board, we've got one class, one goal, we're working together, and we're using other students to do the recognition board. Lots of people have talked about, so we like the recognition board, we get the idea, but I can't spend all lesson every day doing a recognition board. So firstly, a recognition board is really useful when you're teaching a new routine. It's not something you have to use every single lesson of every day for the rest of your teaching career. It's not one of those. So there'll be times when you're not using a recognition board. There'll be times where you're quite happy that you've established the routines. There'll be a point, perhaps, once the behaviour management is really embedded, that you'll just come back to recognition boards now and again while you're sharpening up techniques. For newly qualified teachers, for people who are trying to establish themselves, a recognition board might be used quite intensively. So we need to think very creatively about how we can recognise learners on the recognition board without taking time. So just a few bits straight off. The first one is user responsible student. You might want to rotate that, so you can very quickly say, all right, Jack, that's 2, pop them on the board, and you don't even have to move from where you are. You don't have to stop what you're doing in order to get the tallies up on the board or to get names on the board. You can use a responsible student, and certainly even in a primary school you'd be able to find a couple of children who would quite willingly take turns in recording the tallies or the names. And of course then you've got things like electronic solutions to that, some of which are really nice and very elegant. Things like Class Dojo, lots of people use that, which means that you can, from a smartphone, from an iPad, press the button, reinforce one of the learners, and it pops up on the electronic screen. And of course, you don't necessarily have to have something that's at the front of the classroom. I know lots of teachers who just have something that's quite portable. The jar of marbles that you literally pop one in and it's sat right next to you and you take it around the classroom. Or with some of the year 1 classes we work with, they have a box full of pieces of marble runs. And so when a child, for instance, takes a risk or in a science experiment takes the lead, then they get to take the piece of the marble run and put it in position on the massive magnetic board, and suddenly it's tactile and it's creative. So I think part of this is working out how you can do your recognition board in the flow of your own teaching. And of course we're so different teachers in our style and how we use our time. With some of my classes I used to use a little clicker, like you'd use on a bus when you're walking up the bus counting the number of children on the bus. And that little click the children got to hear, so they knew when, who's got that, sir? And you'd be able to either tell them, for those children who like praise in public, or just say, well, we're going to keep that private, but the points are adding up and the recognition is building. So, I think, as with most ideas in behaviour management, you take the core of it and then you adapt it and adjust it to your learners, to your context, and to how you teach. So question 4, there it is on the screen. It's funny because I have just landed back from Cardiff working with ACT Training, who work with alternative provision, pupil referral units, young offenders, and a huge range of learners in South Wales who for one reason or another struggle to maintain their position in mainstream education. So let's start from the perspective of students who are deliberately not seeming to care, who are trying to avoid any introduction of change in your behaviour management plan. I think there's kind of 2 routes you want to go, and you'd have to really think, Jessica, about these students and what's going to be most effective. For some students, they do need a little push down the negative consequences. They need some time out, some time to talk to you, some time to redraw the expectations. So I might well be using my negative consequences ladder to underline that this is not optional, and disrupting the class is totally unacceptable. I think the first thing is to make it clear to those students that you will not accept their disruption, because what you accept ends up being what you get. And so although by not accepting it you don't solve it instantly, it does just draw that line in the sand. I think that clearly using rapport, trying to get a connection with those learners, is not something you do in the class. That's some investment of your time outside of the class, in public places, saying hello to them, eating lunch in the same place, having a quiet word and a quick word as they run past you playing football at break. Just a gentle drip feed of rapport with those learners, and making sure that they understand that you're not just going to use the negative consequences. Actually, what you're looking for is a change in behaviour here. So I would be, if I needed to, removing them from the lesson for a timeout. I'd be restoring, I'd be redrawing lines of acceptable behaviour, and then I'd be looking for help. And for me, the best help lies with the most experienced teachers, and those for whom the children you're talking about, Jessica, don't seem to have a problem. I would want to learn from them. I'd want to go and observe their class. I'd want to know, what the key is, which positive reinforcement actually does work. And then you haven't mentioned any strategies you might have used outside of the classroom, Jessica, and I wonder whether it might be a chance to look at parents. It might be a chance to speak to your line managers. At Pivotal, we're always determined to get line managers and senior managers to stand alongside members of staff when they have problems, to support them visually, and not to have this idea that you just pass problems up the line till they meet the biggest beast and somehow that big beast has magic dust. I think if you're genuinely building a culture of collaborative behaviour management and true consistency, then managers stand alongside their teachers and show them how to do it, or just listen while that teacher is doing it and give them some feedback. So I think, what's for sure is you can't accept this continuing much longer. You can't afford for the 28 other students to be disruptive. So you need to very firmly draw the line with those students, work on the rapport at the same time, draw in experience, speak to parents if necessary, and get a plan to really underline with those learners that kind of behaviour is not going to be continuing in your classroom. I think great behaviour management is that balance between the yin and the yang. And we're very positive here, and the whole course we've done is very, very positive and really focused on the positive aspects of behaviour management. But let's not misinterpret the positive bit for weakness. Kindness is not weakness here, and when we need to be strong, when we need to hold to our negative consequences, then we will do. Not in an aggressive way and never in a nasty way. But actually, I think you need to find some space to speak to those students and really underline your expectations and your standards, and get to the point where you're saying to them, when you walk into my lab next week, when you walk into the workshop next week, can you talk me through exactly how you're going to conduct yourself? Clearly, there may be an issue in terms of the environment. Where are they sitting? Who are they working with? But I'm sure you've probably looked at those issues already. So thanks, Jessica. That was our question 4. And on to question 5. It's on the screen for you. And we've talked already this evening a little bit about resetting expectations. And of course on the course we talk about basic rules and basic routines. So this is an interesting question. It reminds me of starting with a year 11 set that I really struggled to get on top with when I changed jobs, because of course people always talk about newly qualified teachers as struggling with behaviour, but I changed job as a head of faculty, moved to a much larger school as a head of faculty, and for the first time really struggled to get established because nobody knew me, there was no trust with the learners, and I had that year 11 set that I struggled to get on top of. I think the first thing to do is be really honest with them. If you've struggled to set your expectations and your standards, if you've made mistakes, draw a line. Monday morning, come back, first thing to do, just apologise to them. I mean, tell them how it is. I've made some mistakes in the first few weeks of term. I haven't really made it clear to you the standard of behaviour that I expect and the standard of work I expect. So I've done some thinking over the weekend, and I've got a plan, and I want to talk it through with you. So it's not a heavily emotional apology, but it really does just draw the line and say, what was going on before wasn't quite how I wanted it, so let's just start afresh. In fact, that conversation, that apology that I made to them, there was no instant reaction. It was really interesting. They were almost silenced by it. And it wasn't until a few months later that a couple of them came to me and said, "Sir, when you said sorry to us for all the stuff that had gone on before, we really like that. We really appreciate that." They wouldn't say it in the moment, but you could see something had changed. They're year 11. They're top year 11 set. Okay, interesting. So they're year 11. If you are new into the school, clearly they've had experience of a different culture, a different set of teachers. So, you need to tread a little bit gently with them. I would be talking to them just about the first routine. So that's some thinking for you, Jason. What is the most important routine you need to teach them? And I would think less about behaviour. Year 11, I'd be thinking more about what's the routine I need to teach them that is going to help them get their grades, that's going to push them on even further. What is it that's really the stumbling block? Focus on that routine, break it down into 3 with them, talk to them about it. Okay, this is what I really need from you. Give me 3 behaviours or 3 things that will make sure that happens. And then I would be displaying that 3-step process, or ask them to create some kind of display from it, whether it's pictorial, whether it's language, whether it's some kind of agreed cues between you. And then I'd agree a recognition method, whether it's the recognition board or whether it's something a little bit more individual to that class, using Jenga pieces and building the Jenga tower, or any number of easy ways to just show recognition for the learners. And I think what's interesting is, how can the end of that question is about not being patronizing towards learners. And lots of you on the course, interestingly, have talked about, well, can I do positive notes with FE? And can I do a recognition board with FE? I mean, will it work? And the strange thing is that in our heads as teachers, we think, well, that's a strategy for age 10 to 11. It won't work with any older children. But I always say to teachers, just try it out, because I think you'll be surprised at how some of the strategies we use with younger children work beautifully for older children. I remember using as a primary school teacher originally. I'd always have a box of stamps, and I would stamp children's work with the hippo stamp, the elephant stamp, the the rabbit stamp. And I was sitting and marking year 7 books. I was just sitting, marking the books, and I had my A-level students who were sort of looking over my shoulder. And they saw me with this stamp, and they said to me, why don't we get those? Why don't we get this stamp? And I said, you're joking, aren't you? You're 17, 18 years old. Why would you need a funny stamp? They say, I want the rabbit stamp. I want the hippo. I'll have the alligator. They were absolutely serious. So I have a small list that I entitle Rewards That Work But Shouldn't. And I include on that list a psychology teacher from an FE college who after hearing one of my sessions, came up to me and said, I do that sort of reward thing even with my students. And I said, well, that's interesting. She said, yeah, I've got a psychology group, psychology A-level group. And she said, what we do at the end of the week for a reward is we read a story. I said, okay, that sounds interesting. So you sort of pass the book around, what happens? She said, no, I read to them. I said, what do you mean you read to them? I said, well, like a primary school teacher would read to their children. She said, yeah, that's what they're asking me to do. I said, that's really bizarre. She said, yeah, what's even more bizarre is they've started bringing in carpet tiles and have established a reading corner in the corner of my psychology room. I think there's a PhD in psychology just right there. But it's strange that some rewards you think are appropriate for younger learners work beautifully for olders. Positive notes we used at New College Nottingham, a massive FE college, 12 sites across the city, and they give little cards and they've got the word praise on them. And there's different language. They're kind of meant to be a bit cooler, a bit more grown up than perhaps a positive note for a young child, but the same message, it's the same thing. So I think the learners will tell you when you're being patronising. And I would be listening to them rather than sort of overthinking it and not taking a risk with a strategy because you assume that they might be too old for it. So thanks for that, Jason. That's a great question.
I think you've slightly answered the next question as well.
I have answered the next question. Well, yes, but I'm sure I've got a few more bits and pieces.
There are more questions. So
there are always more questions. So question 6. Older learners. Okay, look. Phone calls home for people in their early 20s, I agree. It's probably not the right way to go. But don't forget, you've got other adults, other teachers in your institution, in an FE college, and working with apprentices who would like to hear their good news. So it may not be that you phone home, but you might well speak to the tutor privately and say, could you just next time you see Sam, just reinforce how fantastic it is. You can do your student of the week thing internally. You can have your positive notes, again, written appropriately. People really, really like things that are handwritten and given to them. I mean, it doesn't have to be a cheesy positive note. It can just be on a white piece of card. I have some that I use for adults that just say, they're pre-printed and they say, just a quick note to say thank you. And then I can handwrite whatever I need to underneath. I think we all want to feel proud, and any way of you being able to do that, whether it's a certificate, whether it's a prize giving, whether it's student of the week, and then of course your students will choose whether to go and show their parents, and you bet many of them will. So I don't think notes home are necessarily for younger children. I just think they need to be written more appropriately. And I also say on that is lots of the schools, lots of the colleges we work at, they don't just give their positive notes to their learners. They have a culture of sending notes between each other. Because of course, if you are really talking about a change in culture, you're talking about a change in staff to staff relationships as well as staff to students. I love this question, Jane. I really love this question. Not least because, I can't name the school, but I had exactly that problem. I went to a school in central London, big urban secondary school. They were having a lot of issues with behaviour, and there were, I think, slightly more. I think there were sort of 16 students who just decided they weren't going to go to lessons, and they just ran around the corridors and classrooms, and nobody could catch them. So, yeah, great question. Difficult answer, though, as you can imagine. I think one of the things that we spend quite a lot talking to teachers about, particularly in environments where you've got that kind of high tariff behaviour going on and almost being normalised, is that teachers need to really tighten down on their consistency and on giving learners permission to leave the room. And one of the things you do with a school that's really chaotic or an environment that's really wobbly is you keep learners in classrooms, and you stop this kind of 3 people going to the toilet and 5 going off to the library, the resource centre, and a couple going to ask Mr. Davis for something. We try to keep the learners in the classroom. If you've got that number of students running amok, that's a whole school issue, and that's an issue I'd expect to see the senior leaders being involved in, and also the faculty managers and pastoral leads as well. These students clearly are not going to be dealt with effectively en masse, so you're going to have to start to prioritise which students are we going to get to first, where should they be, who let them out of the room, and how can we keep them engaged in the learning. So it is that one by one by one. But I know how unsettling it is for the other classes when you've got so much disturbance in the corridors. And I've been doing a lot of work with pupil referral units and some mainstream schools just on that, on the amount of times the classroom door is open and closed. In some pupil referral units, you can feel the atmosphere just get wobbly because people are going in and out of classrooms all the time. You know, somebody goes out to the toilet, the next person's going, the LSA is going to run an errand. Now somebody has to be taken out of the classroom because they've been poorly behaved, and suddenly everyone wants to know what's going on. Other people are trying to leave the classroom, and all day the door's going in and out, in and out. So you've got this idea actually that the learning's not so important if it can be disturbed that easily, and that in itself is a corrosive element to the culture that you want to try and promote. I think finally, Jane, the one thing that schools, colleges sometimes ignore are the environmental factors. So let's go back to this 8 students running amok through the corridors and classrooms. One of the things I said because what was happening was these students were sort of doing a circuit of the school, and so we just sat down and worked out which doors needed to be locked and how we could stop them doing that circuit. And actually, we started to reduce their movement by limiting their access to the environment. So there are often things you can do environmentally, as well as addressing the direct behaviours of those learners. And I think there's a case for giving them a little bit of time out from the cut and thrust of everyday learning if running around the corridors is the thing they want to do. I think that point needs to be made to them very, very clearly, and the consequences of that mapped out very clearly as well.
Okay, we've got a few more questions that have come in this evening, and also a few more that we've got time for from the discussion forum. We haven't got these written up, so you'll have to bear with us as I read them out for you. Terry has just asked if you've got any tips for a behavioural unit where you don't have time to get to know the pupils. And I suppose that this is a similar situation for supply teachers and cover supervisors and those working with a variety of different people. Please bear with Paul, as he hasn't actually heard this question. So these are now blind questions.
Yeah, that glazed look on my face is quite obvious, I'm sure. So let's just run it again because now I haven't got it in front of me. Okay,
so have you got any tips for behavioural unit staff that work in behaviour units?
Short term, okay. Right.
When you don't have time to get to know the pupils.
So the most important thing there is that you have consistency between the staff that are working there, that you have an induction process that really explains to those learners what is expected of them, how you're going to work. If you're working in across multiple sites, that induction process needs to be centralised. And you need to make sure that the children are aware of the system first and personality second, which is kind of odd, but I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to put them back into mainstream within 6 weeks. Here's the truth. That's a really, really difficult model to operate. Really tough model to operate. And you need very experienced staff as well who are able to build rapport fast, but not relationships. Experienced staff can do matching, leading, mirroring. They can hook into the students' interests. They can have a wider view, have knowledge of them in the community as well, which also helps. But for instance, turning someone around in 6 weeks after they've been excluded from one school and dropping them into another, it is a very, very difficult thing to do unless you've got highly experienced staff whose sole responsibility is doing that. And, I was talking today with the staff from the pupil referral units about the fact that the children you're dealing with are children who do not trust adults anymore. Not through any fault of the teaching profession, but because of what's happened at home, because of what's happened in their past. And so the adults they do trust have to do an awful lot of work to gain that trust and sustain it. And I don't know if I can build trust with a learner in 6 weeks. In fact, that would be slightly odd to do that, because I don't want them to rely on me and then get dropped straight back into mainstream. So I think, there are ways you can do it. Clear induction, really consistent behaviour policy, written on one side of A4 so that everyone knows it. Learners taught the system first, as a priority, and then links with the school where they're going back into, or the link for where their next move is also really important, because it's that relationship that you want to sustain. But you can see the problem, right? Children who don't trust adults, the worst thing we can do for them is to give them churn. So, new school, different adults, new school, new social worker, different targets, troubled families unit, here's a few more targets, learning mentor, here's, lots of people who with all the best intentions are trying to do the right thing, but actually what they need is consistent mentoring. Most of the kids we work with, they're just screaming out for a dad, or screaming out to try and cover the pain that they're feeling. And what do we give them? We just give them more and more adults who work with them for a short period and then leave. So I would be induction, systems, and then very quickly trying to bridge to where they're going and trying to build a relationship with the new member of staff who's going to receive them. Not a perfect answer, Terry, but it's a really imperfect world there. And I know, a few years back, the government was obsessed with the sort of 6 week time period of putting children back into schools. And where I see it done well, it's very, very impressive, but I don't see it done well very often. And sometimes I think these young people need a little bit more time out of mainstream. And for me, mainstream is not the holy grail. Pupil referral units, good pupil referral units are excellent places to be, with extremely good staff and the kind of therapeutic support that learners need, away from the sort of behavioural approaches to actually come back under the umbrella of a school behaviour policy.
Okay. The next question is from Alison, and it was in the discussion forum. It's about how you engage passive learners. So she says that she has a year 10 GCSE class who are mostly cooperative and well behaved, but won't engage in discussion. They won't answer questions, or even low level recall, and it's like pulling teeth to get a good learning feel in the classroom. What can she do? So this is sort of learning attitudes, I suppose, rather than behaviour management.
Yeah, and I think it's maybe where the two things cross over, isn't it? That I'm thinking, right, on my recognition board, there's nothing behavioural. What I want to do is catch them deep in discussion. So my expectation is going to be that I catch them responding to questions, or I catch them in groups discussing, and I'm going to recognise them for that. also immediately thinking about other mechanisms you can use for the learners to exchange ideas rather than always having to voice them and speak out. So, mini whiteboards are not the most original thing, but it does give that opportunity. Are you asking them, do you have a huge big piece of paper on the floor where they can pool all their ideas in big pens and post-it notes rather than constantly relying for that feedback? And then I'd be looking to some of your students who are perfectly capable and willing to speak out and discuss, to try and create a model of what you want. In fact, very often when I had year 11 groups and they had finished their exams, I would ask them to come back and make model videos of what I expected of, for instance, group work or a discussion, and I'd video them doing it so that the learners that I had coming could be really clear on the standard that they were aiming for and what I expected. Very often in teaching, we know exactly what we want. We know exactly the routine we want. We know the speed of response that we want. We know the kind of depth of discussion that we want from our learners. But we very rarely take the time to properly explain that. So a little bit of time explaining those expectations, a mechanism for recognizing when they do meet them, and then some really creative thinking about how they might be able to pool ideas. Do you have a wiki that they pool ideas onto immediately online? Do you have a Twitter account where they can tweet ideas from their laptops in the classroom or from one device that's being passed around? Is it post-it notes? Is it something very analog? Is it using those pens that you can write on the window, or the pens that you can write on the desk with as well? And lots of, Twitter is full of really good examples of doing that. And you can get paint that you can paint onto the walls and paint onto tables. So if you really want to go for it, you can create the whole room as a writable space. So suddenly ideas can be transferred without the need for speaking out. But actually, once you've done that, the discussion becomes naturally very, very in-depth because we're now making connections. We've got pens everywhere. I saw a picture of a classroom completely covered in white paint. I'll speak to Daryl because I know that Daryl Williams, one of our trainers, has worked in that room, and I think somewhere there's one somewhere in Essex, and it's head to toe white, and you can just write anywhere you like. It's fantastic.
Okay, sort of the polar opposite of that question, Paul, is from Kim, who's asked, she's got a class where they're very engaged in group activities and discussions. The problem is moving out of those group activities back into situations where she's teaching to the whole class or they're working individually. She can't stop them. She can't stop that level of engagement, and she's finding that hard to move from one situation into another. Can you give some advice on that?
I think lots of teachers would say, can we have your class? Because we'd really like that problem. That sounds like a great problem to have.
And she did acknowledge that that's a great problem to have.
That is the best problem in the world. Again, it's about transitions, isn't it? You're talking about how do I transfer from very noisy, engaged classroom to really focused, need to give you a minute's worth of information. So your countdown, again, embellished with positive reinforcement would be useful. I tend to use countdown timers. You can, on YouTube, if you just put in countdown timer for any length of time you want, there are a million different groovy countdown timers. And you can use those to count down, and of course that they're engaged in that. I'm a bit weird. I have I have a bag of whistles. Okay, there's a fantastic shop in Birmingham, which is, believe it or not, it's called the Acme Whistles factory, and you can go to the factory. I have a huge range of whistles. I've got an owl whistle, a crow call, all sorts, a steam train whistle, and I do train my classes to transition from different activities according to the different sound of the whistle. So really nice to reinforce your routine with a live whistle, maybe a musical sound. I know that one of the schools I work with in North London, which is a Jewish school, in transitions between lessons, they play Hava Nagila and they dance. The students and staff dance between lessons. So, a musical cue can work brilliantly. You can train them in silent cues as well. I think your class sound like they're quite buzzy and they'd quite enjoy the challenge of seeing how quickly they could fall silent with different cues, and you could play a game where you try different cues for different transitions, and you get them to do them fast and slow and get them used to that. So again, the routine, a clear cue, and some time to practice that with the learners. And obviously don't be too harsh on them, because we would all want that class who is deeply engaged.
Okay. There's a question from Catherine, who says that she understands that it's important not to shout and to speak to pupils quietly and get down to their level when you're having difficult conversations. But she had a student that she found it difficult to do this with. She used to sit next... she used to leave her seat when she was trying to talk to her and move further and further away from her, trying to engage her in a sort of cat and mouse game. She doesn't really know how to handle that situation, to have that quiet word if the student doesn't want to do that.
Okay, so the first thing is don't if a student moves away from you when you're having that conversation, don't follow them, because you're not at their beck and call, and it's not for them to set the pace or indeed the situation where you're going to have that conversation. So I think what I would be doing is I'd be sitting down with that student and talking to them seriously about what I'm doing. I would be explaining to them the script. I'd show them the script I was going to use, and I'd say, this is the script that I'm trying to go through with you. It's the same script I use for everybody else. I would be saying to them that there are a couple of options, that if the learner does not want you to come and kneel down next to them in the class, then what you'll do is you'll ask for them to just stand up and move to the side of the room so you can talk to them there. Or if it's practicable where you are, for the learner to come and just sit at your desk while you speak to them. Is it the privacy issue? Is it that they really don't want to be spoken to so that other people can hear? Well, you can sort that out. If it's, which it probably is just them trying to see if they can break your game or break your new strategy, then you have to show them very clearly that that's not going to happen. And I would be then saying to them, the next time I speak to you, we've agreed that I'm going to pull you to the side of the room. If next lesson you do need to speak to that learner and you ask them to come to the side of the room and they don't, then I think you're absolutely right to pursue some negative consequences for that, to come back to that meeting where you have agreed what's going to happen. And I want my line manager in that meeting as well, just so they can show that we're really serious about this, and I'm not going to waste my time in lessons chasing learners who have been poorly behaved and then are trying to make some game out of it. So I think, taking them out of that situation and speaking to them privately is the best thing you can do, but then following up if the behaviour doesn't change, and be as relentless as you possibly can. What's clear about managing behaviour is that learners judge their teachers in two different categories. The ones that follow up and that really follow up relentlessly, and the ones that never follow up. I mean, if you know somebody's never going to follow up, then there's kind of a disincentive for behaving well for them if your desire is to misbehave. But if you know somebody constantly follows up, you check your behaviour. You behave differently for them. You're slightly more wary about taking a risk with really poor behaviour. And students, learners are discriminating between those different types of teachers all the time. And I go back to one of the most important things I ever learned as a teacher, which was when you have a difficult incident, when you have a student who's rude to you, who's appallingly behaved and badly disruptive, you must write down what happened immediately and then use that to follow up. Most teachers don't write it down immediately, so then they forget what happened precisely and it all becomes a bit muddled. Or they sort of write it down, make all the right noises, but actually tomorrow's another day, and that they forget to follow up again. So that follow up is so critical.
Okay, interesting question here, Paul, from Tim, who's just posted it up in the chat for this webinar. What routines could you, as the class teacher, put in place to help when your students have cover lessons? So if your lesson is being covered by somebody else, how can you, as the class teacher, help the cover supervisor? Because often people play up for cover teachers.
Okay. You can do as much as you can, right? But of course, the way that cover teachers are treated is part of the culture of the school. And for your learners, if the culture is not quite right, the cover teacher, the supply teacher can look like, that they've been fed to the lions. But of course, there are things you can do. The first thing I want to do is I want to speak to that cover teacher. I want to speak to that supply teacher before they take my classes. So if that's the night before, I will take 10 minutes out to Skype them, to speak to them, and to brief them properly. I am not going to accept certain things. So I'm not going to accept, from the cover teacher's point of view, I'm not going to accept that they will not do the work that's been set. I am not going to allow them to write down a crime sheet of the worst behaved students, because all they'll do is write every name, every single one of your students down, and then pass the problem back to you. I would be focusing on one routine that I wanted to see from the learners while I was away. I would focus them on one behaviour that I wanted to see from all of those learners. And then I would ask the cover teacher to record any of the learners who have gone over and above that. So the list you get at the end will not be the crime list of the worst behaved learners. It will be those who have done the right thing. I would also be asking my colleagues, if they've got a minute, could you just drop in tomorrow when the cover teacher's doing Year 9 Set 4? Can you just pop your head round the door? Just so that the children know that this teacher is not alone, that they're connected with the rest of the staff. I've got to say, I'm just writing an article at the moment for Teach Primary magazine about that subject. There's also, I think, on the Pivotal blog, there is an article on supply teaching. It's called "Have You Got a Girlfriend, Miss?" So you can have a look at that. There's some more detailed advice for supply teachers and cover teachers in there. But as every teacher knows, because every teacher's also been a student, and I'm very, very guilty of it myself as a student, that giving cover teachers and supply teachers a rough ride has become something of a rite of passage in many schools. So again, what we try to promote is not behaviour management that is all about the personality of one individual teacher. It is this idea that for the students, that any adult that intervenes, regardless of who they are, where they come from, and what their role is, every single adult, like every child, must be treated with absolute respect. And I think once you've got that culture built up, you can have cover teachers, supply teachers, visiting teachers treated with as much respect as their ordinary teacher, but it does take time, and it also takes time, to ensure that you have the standards that you want. One of the things that always surprises me about particularly supply teachers, because cover teachers are often, a full part of the staff and fully integrated, but one of the things that often strikes me about supply teachers is how poorly they can be vetted by the people booking them from the school. My attitude is always the same. If you're going to book a supply teacher, they're not there just to babysit. They're not there just to sit at the desk and do marking. I wouldn't employ a locum GP and expect them to sit in the GP's office and not see any patients. I want supply teachers to do a full day's work and to be working as hard as the other members of staff, which means dealing with some of the tough stuff as well, and taking some of the responsibility to follow up themselves, not just passing it back to the teacher in absentia the next day.
Okay, we've got time for, we've got a quick one, and we might be able to squeeze in another one after that. Liz has been asking on the discussion forum within the online course how you would handle the meet and greet if there's a very quick changeover between lessons, and sometimes learners have to move quite a distance between classes. And that sort of meet and greet, if you're meeting and greeting everybody at the door and shaking hands, can eat into the lesson. How do you get around that?
It's an important part of the lesson, but I know what you mean. It doesn't want to take too long. My experience is that when I start shaking the hands of learners, very quickly that becomes a high five or a fist pump or a little touch. So they shorten that for you. I mean, I don't think a long, lingering handshake is really what you want to be doing, because with 30 students that can take a long time. The handshake for me, it's a personal preference. I really, really like it, but meeting and greeting is more important. If you don't have time to do the handshake, then being at the door, smiling, having a quick hello is perfectly all right. Lots of teachers are moving between classes and say, well, I can't possibly meet and greet. I say, well, meet and greet along the way. Walk down the line of your students if you want to make it really efficient, and say good morning to each of them rather than standing right at the door. Again, it's just trying to work these ideas into your rhythm. The key thing here is that every single learner feels valued, like they belong and like they're important. If you rush that, they're not going to feel very important, very valued at all. So it's difficult without seeing you do it, but for me, that extra minute, okay, it might take a minute out of learning time, but it might be that moment that really connects you with that learner and really starts to build the rapport. And in that way, it's a minute really well spent.
Okay, right, this is the last one, Paul. You've got 2 minutes exactly for this. How can you deal with disruptive behaviour when you're talking to the whole class and you want to continue talking to the whole class? Good question. This is from Rosemary in the discussion forum.
Thank you, Rosemary. That's a great question. Look, I want to deal with behaviour privately as much as possible, but I'm also a pragmatist. I also realise that I can't stop talking to the whole class and then go and speak to someone privately and then go back to speaking to the whole class. So I say this to the learners. If you interrupt me while I'm talking to you, I cannot give you a private warning or a private rule reminder. And so when I am interrupted in the middle of speaking, I will say, right, Chelsea, that is a warning. I'm sorry I've had to do that in public, but you've interrupted me. And then after I finish speaking to the rest of the class, I will go back to Chelsea and say, you realise why I had to do that. Please don't make me do that again. It's embarrassing for both of us. So I really make the point to the learners. I don't want to do it. I'd much rather not, but I can't have you interrupting me when I'm speaking. That's just not happening. And so I will give public warnings where I have to, or indeed where the environment necessitates that I must. Sometimes when you're out of the school or college environment, you're in open spaces, you're in a public place, sometimes you do need to speak to students in front of the others. The key here is that same 8 out of 10. I want to get it right 8 out of 10 times, and my learners will forgive me for the 2 times out of 10 where I get it slightly wrong, or indeed where I have to use a different technique because of where we are or what we're doing.
Okay. Thanks, Paul.
That's us. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for Thank you for being part of the National Science Learning Centre's course. We have really enjoyed designing it and doing it for you. Thank you for being part of this webinar. And please do look at the suite of resources on the National Science Learning Centre's site. There's so much more CPD there. Indeed, there is on our site as well, pivotaleducation.com. There's so much free stuff there as well. So make use of all these free resources and let's keep talking through the forums. Thanks very much for your time tonight. Bye-bye.